somebody asked me, they said, how would you feel if somebody spoke to your son in the way that you speak to yourself? And when it had all calmed down afterwards, my dad turned to the guy, our fighter, and he said to them, whatever happens tonight, we're not going to be bullied. And it was such a powerful coaching lesson, and it took me a long time to sort of climb back out of that hole. So I was functioning, but it was coming at a cost.
Welcome to the Unstoppable Podcast with your host, Johnny Pearce. In this podcast, we are going to cover all you need so that you can develop unstoppable confidence and build an unbreakable mindset. And we will make sure that everything you listen to is unforgettable. We will dissect the lessons from the people you want to hear from, and you have access to this completely free of charge. And if you like it, don't forget to share it with your friends, and I will see you on the inside.
Team, welcome back to episode 16 of the Unstoppable Podcast. I'm incredibly excited because I've got a role model of mine that I've had since I first started this podcast. This guy actually inspired me to start this podcast, put it out there, put myself out there, everything that they share. And what he will share today is all about performing at your absolute best. It's about taking risks. It's about challenging yourself. It's about stepping out of your comfort zone and doing something out of the ordinary. And that was exactly what this podcast was for me. It was being able to put myself out there. It was being able to deliver value for free and share lessons that I know will help everyone listening completely free of charge. And it's an opportunity to sit down, have a coffee. And today we are joined by Damian Hughes. Damian, thank you for coming.
It's an absolute privilege to be invited, Johnny, and thanks for your really kind and generous introduction as well. I'm humbled.
Yeah, it's great. And for those of you that don't know, anyone that doesn't listen to the High Performance Podcast, Damian Hughes is an international speaker. He speaks in some of the largest companies in the world. He has worked in elite sport, and he's also the co-host of the High Performance Podcast. They've interviewed Gary Barlow, Rio Ferdinand, Usain Bolt, Lando Norris, Gordon Ramsay, Grylls. The list could go on. There's a lot of big names in there. They've got already 85 million views on YouTube alone, and I think they might have only kicked off in 2020. So yeah, we'll hear more about that. But Damian, I suppose, tell us more about that journey.
The journey with the High Performance Podcast?
Yeah, with the podcast, kind of, I suppose how it started and all those good things.
Yeah, of course. So, well, before we explain the podcast, we probably have to go back and explain our background. So I do it with my friend, Jake Humphrey. And Jake's got an interesting story. He grew up in a small village in Norfolk. And then sort of through his own wiles and his own talents, he ended up as a children's TV presenter. And then from there, sort of backed himself to end up fronting Formula One coverage for the BBC before he left. And then fronted the Premier League and into that and Champions League for BT Sport, as it was then, TNT Sport now. And my background is I grew up in Manchester, but I grew up in sort of the boxing gyms of the city. My dad was a boxing coach. So I'd been immersed in sort of high-performing sports from as far back as I can remember. I was around guys that were going off fighting for Olympic Games, world titles, and all other kinds of demands within that sport. So I was around sort of high performance and high performing cultures from a really young age. And that was my career of going in and sort of working with coaches in elite sport, helping them create high performing cultures. So Jake and I then met in the summer of 2019. I had a contract. I was working with Norwich City Football Club, working with the coaches and the director of football there to create a high-performing culture. And Jake lives in the city. We ended up sort of meeting at a dinner. And while we were chatting, we sort of realised that we'd come to the same place just from very different points of view. So Jake tells the story that he used to be in the Formula One pit lanes, meeting all these like billionaire team bosses and superstar racing drivers. And he'd be asking the question like, what's the secret? And they'd be like, what do you mean, what's the secret? Like, how did you get here? And these people will be going, I worked hard, I took my chances, I was optimistic, I learned my craft. So he was learning all this, and I'd almost been learning this from my own perspective as well, of in the boxing gyms and being around coaches. you realise creating the right culture is about good coaching, getting good people, good systems, good processes. And I call my work like the work in the shadows, the stuff that you don't see. So you see the stuff that the performance under the bright lights, but my stuff is in the shadows, as Jake's was in the pit lane. So we said, wouldn't it be great if we could almost shine a light in the shadows where we could say to people, this isn't just about being born with great talent or having a great network list or being able to just get lucky. There's lots of things that people can be taking and incorporating into their own lives in whatever endeavour they want. So we sort of set off with this idea of just shining a light in the shadows, which is how it basically started. So we made a contact list of people that we knew that we had sort of like trusted relationships. And that word there, Johnny, trusted, is really important here because we needed to speak to people about failures and setbacks and mistakes, as well as the lessons and the successes that they'd achieved. So we needed to have that kind of trust with people that would be willing to share and expose some of those lessons that they'd learned. So between the two of us, we had a pretty decent list of about 10 people. So I'd worked for 3 years with Tracy Neville when she was the head coach of the England Roses netball team when they went on to win the first gold medal at the Commonwealth Games. You know, I'd known Ole Gunnar Solskjaer for a long time from when he'd been the reserve team coach at Manchester United. Jake knew people like Rio Ferdinand through his work on BT Sport. So between the two of us, we pulled together a list and then we just said, let's see how it goes. So the two of us just turned up down in Portsmouth to go meet Sir Ben Ainsley, where he had his sort of sailing yard. And we like, the analogy I often use, Johnny, is that I don't know what I'm doing in terms of broadcasting and things like that. So I'm sort of sat there and I'd done my prep, I shared it with Jake. And then Jake went, are you ready? And I went, I said, Ben Ainsley sat opposite us. Jake sat next to me. I'm sat there. And I went, yeah, fine. So Jake then went, right, okay, we'll press play and we go. And have you ever had that moment, you know, when you stand on the platform of a train station and there's a train that's not stopping at the station, passes through, and it sort of like sucks the air out of the out of the environment, like the platform seems to like shake a little bit, you know, and like it's a charged atmosphere. And that was what it was like, sat next to this sort of really fantastic broadcaster with bringing like 20 years of live television broadcast experience. And I remember sat there looking at Jake as he sort of spoke in this really polished, unfaltering sort of manner. I remember sat there thinking, you're really good. Like, that's a real skill that I've never appreciated. So I'm sort of looking at him and admiring this skill. Ben Ainsley's responding. And then about 5 minutes in, it dawned on me, I thought, better say something. We sort of had the conversation and I really just loved it. But what was interesting for us was when we said to Ben Ainsley afterwards, we said, you must have loads of conversations like that. Sorry for boring you. And he was like, no, very rarely do I get asked questions like this. You know, I've enjoyed doing it. And Jake and I looked at each other and were like, oh, that's an interesting answer. So then we did more of these interviews like Tom Daly, then we did Rio Ferdinand at his restaurant in Manchester. And the more we're doing it, the more we're like, they seem to enjoy not just talking about like winning the Champions League in Rio Ferdinand's case or Tom Daly talking about winning the gold medals. Tom wanted to talk about the experience he had when he was 10 years of age and he first did his diving competition. And he was just engulfed with nerves. And he remember saying to his dad, I'm not sure I can do this. I want to go home. Let's get back in the car. And his dad had said to him, how many people are diving here today? And he'd gone 18. And he went, listen, whatever happens today, even if you come last, you are the 18th best diver in the country. And he wanted to share that really simple reframing of a challenge rather than talk about the gold medal, because we can all see that it was the stuff that had got him to the gold medal, the stuff in the shadows that really came to life. So we did these interviews, like Mauricio Pochettino invited us to his house. Now, I'll be honest with you, Johnny, I've never been to a place, you know, where it takes you 5 minutes to walk down the driveway. Like, these people were sort of trusting us to come into their world and share it with us. So that's not something we took lightly. And I think what like what was evident, we weren't trying to stitch them up. We're not trying to make fun of them or set them up for failure. We want to explore this stuff in a way that says, how can anyone listening to this go, oh, I could do that, or I've faced that, or, I can incorporate that into my life. So we recorded 10 episodes and then we put them out. Now, this is the bit where we got really, like, I want to use the word fortunate, but in the sense of the podcast, not the rest of the world. But then podcasts, COVID happened as we launched the podcast. And you remember that period where people were only allowed out of the house an hour a day. And I think people were sort of really keen for just new content rather than watching repeats and things like that on the telly. Now, this was an accident, certainly not designed, but the podcast came out around that time. And I think people just listened to it because it was new content. And then enough people went, oh, look, that resonates. I can find something useful with that. So it sort of snowballed from there. So we're nearly 5 years on now since we first launched it. We've done nearly 350 of these interviews, and you referenced some of the amazing people we've been fortunate enough to talk to. But it still just feels like a real privilege to me. Like there's a couple of things that I feel privileged about. One is, like, when you get older and you're still a young man, like meeting new people and making friends sort of happens less and less because you get into routine. So sort of making friends with Jake has been a real privilege because, he's a fantastic lad, and I really enjoy his company for lots of different reasons. But then secondly, the privilege of just getting to sit and learn at the feet of some of these incredible people that are sharing insights and knowledge and just sort of truth bombs that they're dropping back and forth, that I just sit there and just often just can't believe how privileged I am to be in that position of doing it. And then the third thing that I feel really fortunate about is that like people listen to it, and the most satisfying thing is that people say, you know what, I found that really helpful. We've had people we had a guy on recently from a band called McFly, a guy called Danny Jones, who spoke really, really quite moving and candidly about the trauma of at 18, his parents separated, and he basically had to take over being the man of the house at a young age, where he ended up paying the mortgage for his mum, taking care of his sister. And he sort of assumed the mantle of adulthood when he was still a relatively young adolescent bloke, and how he sort of tried to reconcile that for his life. The amount of messages we've had off people talking about similar experiences and how hearing him has helped them is just like one of the more recent examples that just never fails to take my breath away and just makes me feel really, really privileged, as I said, that I get to sit and be a part of something like that. That's a really long-winded answer for you, isn't it? Sorry for...
No, incredible. I could listen to you for hours, and I think it's so interesting and how you speak about the fact that you guys are having such a huge impact. You've already impacted my life, and you've impacted hundreds of thousands of others, and I think that gives you a sense of purpose. It gives you a reason to actually want to get up in the morning because you know that you're doing a great job. And yes, of course, there's an element of the fact that it's a business and it needs to be a business that makes profit, and that's a vital ingredient of a successful business, of course. But if you can marry those two things, the fact that you're running a great business, but also you're running a great business that impacts and changes lives, and that's the beauty of, I think, what I do inside my coaching journey. It's like you have the opportunity to work with someone and actually have a genuine impact. And I wanted to touch upon scratching below the surface. You talked about scratching below the surface with your guests and how they feel grateful that they've had the opportunity to speak about something other than just what they do. And that leads me on to my next question nicely. So if you were to introduce Damian Hughes outside of what you do professionally, who is Damian Hughes?
Oh, well, that's a great question. The first thing is the privilege of my life is being a dad. So I'm a dad to two children, my 15-year-old son and my 12-year-old daughter. So that's like the best job ever. I'm a husband to my wife that we met a long time ago. So we still live in Manchester, where I'm from. So that's like the real privilege of my life. And I talk about that in a way. I think it's important to point out that I became a dad quite late in life. And I always thought it was a real privilege, but there was a period in my life where I got the lines blurred a little bit. And I don't know if this will help for your listeners and the people that you coach. But when I set up my business, I've been running my business for a long time, sort of doing the nature of the work that I just described. And then I became a dad, as I say, quite late. I'd been running it for a few years, and there was something really significant that happened that I could only now make sense of when I look back in hindsight. That running my business, I'd always felt that it was like, if you think of it like being on a tightrope, I always thought if I fell off the tightrope, the only person that would get hurt would be myself. So I could sort of look at the risks that I was taking, made decisions based on the fact that I would be the one that would bear the consequences of it. And then when I became a dad, I wish somebody would have, I wish I'd have known this at the time, but I remember for the first time feeling really acutely responsible for somebody else. And like, that was very normal. But I don't think I didn't have access to a coach and someone that could help me make sense of it, which is where your work is so important and gives you that sense of purpose. I equated in my head being a good dad was about providing as well as I could for my son, which, given that I was the source of providing for him, meant that unconsciously I just said yes to everything. And for the next 18 months, I basically worked myself to a frazzle. And it was about 18 months in, it was my wife who said to me one day, I got home, and she said, "Is this really what you thought being a dad was going to be like?" And like, I'll give anyone listening to this, if your partner ever asks you a question like that, they don't think it is working. But my wife sort of asked me to sort of reflect on it, and it then dawned on me that that what I thought was being a good dad was actually being quite selfish. I was being away an awful lot, and I was justifying it to myself. So the reason I'm sort of making that little detour there, Johnny, is because it took me a while to recognise that being a dad also came with a lot of responsibilities, and that involved sort of learning to say no, learning to be there, learning to try and find a degree of balance in my life, and that's really important to me. And I feel like I don't feel I'm there, but I'm a work in progress in terms of doing that. So that links to the fact that I run my own business. I've done it for a long time, sort of helping leaders, whether that's mainly in sport, but lots of organisations create high-performing cultures. And then I run a charity as well, which is another important part of my purpose. So I said to you, I grew up in a boxing gym, so I ran that as a charity for a long time with my dad that had founded it. And then over the last few years, my commitment to that has sort of had to be diluted since becoming a dad. But over the last few years, I felt I've got the chance to do something significant there. So the charity is called the School Coach Charity, where it came about through a friend of mine is involved at the Manchester United Foundation, and every November they do a second-hand coat event where the Manchester United fans are invited to give away second-hand coats. And when they first did it 3 years ago, I think they had something like 8,000 coats that went in 24 hours. And a lot of them were going to kids that just don't have access to a warm winter coat. So it was as a response to that, I set up the School Coat Charity, where there's like 40% of kids in Manchester are living in poverty. A percentage of them don't have a warm winter coat. So we work with schools that when the school recognises a child in that situation, they just write to us and we just get them a brand new winter coat. So the kid doesn't ever know it's a charity donation. We just give it to them. So there's still a dignity attached to it for the child. But more importantly, it just gives them access to be able to then not worry about the human basics and be able to focus on learning and getting better at what they do. So I've got a few different aspects to my life, I suppose. So that's how I'd probably introduce it. But it's probably being a dad first, being a partner, and then trying to make a difference in the wider world.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I think it's always a hard question because a lot of the time we wrap our identity up in what we do for work. And I know professionally, I found that tough, and I was challenged by a guest speaker at an event I was hosting once to introduce myself outside of what I do, because it's easy. It rolls off the tongue. I'm Johnny, the founder of Built for Better Business. We do X, Y, and Z. that's easy. But then whenever someone kind of strips your professional life away from you, you kind of stumble over the question. I know I did, but you definitely didn't there. And
but that's been a work in progress, Johnny. I mean, I think that's why I said to you when you first asked it, like, what a brilliant question, because it's not what you do, it's who you are, and that speaks to our very sense of our identity. And I was tempted to answer by saying, I'll tell you who I am. I'm somebody that tries to role model kindness, somebody that tries to have a laugh, and somebody that tries to make a positive difference. So I go to the behaviours, because then you go, well, can do that anywhere. You know what I mean? And if you think about it in relation to the podcast, big thing for me is, and part of the agreement between Jake and I when we did it, was that the podcast has to be issued for free. So I know that there's adverts on the podcast that people sometimes get frustrated by them and go, it's free to listen to, it's not free to make. But so we need to take advertising, but to give it away for free is really important to me, because the reason it is because when I was growing up, I did loved access to some of the conversations that we have and some of the lessons that we learn. And I don't see that sort of connections or wealth or privilege should be a barrier to entry for anybody. So we do the podcast for free because that speaks to who I am, which is trying to make a positive difference. So there's a few different ways you can answer it, but it's such a brilliant question. But I can really identify. It took me a long time to uncouple who I was away from what I do. So thank you for asking it.
No, 100%. I love it. And you talked about your kids and the impact, having kids has had on you. And, one of our clients shared with me once, he said something and it really stuck with me. I don't have kids yet, but he said, your kids will never remember what you gave them. They will remember how you made them feel. And I think that's so true because, we as driven individuals, I'm getting married this year. I would love to have kids at some point in my life. And I think, that almost drives me now through my personal development journey because I'm trying to become better and become a better leader so that I can, hopefully, if I'm ever lucky enough, be able to be a leader for my kids. And I think, you can fall into that trap of wanting to provide because you feel like that's going to set them up for their future. But in actual fact, it really doesn't, because they need leadership, they need support, they need time. And it's really a hard-hitting thing. And you've spoke about your dad briefly, and I know for a fact that he's probably one of your biggest inspirations that kind of directed you down this coaching route from what I'm aware of. But, was there anyone that inspired you from the start?
You've touched on it. It was my dad. So his story is incredible. He sort of grew up in sort of Catholic post-war Manchester, where the reason I make reference to that, there's that period in those terms, is that he was born as an illegitimate child, which was a real stigma in the sort of community. So when his mother died, my nan, we found that his birth certificate that she'd hidden away under the floorboards, and across it, he was referred to as a bastard on it. So he was born out of wedlock. So there was a lot of sort of shame attached to that, and that meant that there was two things that influenced him. One, he was illiterate, so he couldn't read or write by the time he had to leave school at 14 to be able to provide for his mother. The second thing was his real passion was boxing, but boxing's one of those sports where you don't play boxing, you just box. And you often need sort of a strong male role model in your life if you're going to go and do it that can stop you getting hurt, stop you being too brave for your own good. And he didn't have that. So he went into boxing, found himself being overmatched and getting himself quite badly hurt because he didn't have a male role model. And he didn't really have much in the way of an education. So those two things eventually led him to becoming a father figure to thousands of young boys. So where he grew up in Manchester, he set up a boxing gym where he wanted to become that strong adult male in the lives of lots of kids, like that he probably saw himself in them. So even before I was born, he'd set up the gym. And he'd had guys, I remember really, like even as a child, like having a couple of guys come back after the Olympic Games with sort of like the great bits and kit and things like that coming to the house. And seeing guys going from amateur to professional and then fighting for British and Commonwealth and European and eventually world titles. So I was around sort of high performance sport from as far back as I can remember. But what always strikes me with that is that that meant I was never sort of overly impressed by the big fight nights under the big bright lights of shining on the ring. What always struck me was the stuff that preceded it. So you'd find out the fight might be happening for big fights like 2 or 3 months in advance. So you'd see the hours that went on that nobody saw in the shadows, the studying of the opponent, looking for that simple tell and insight as to how you were going to beat them, then the structuring of how the training plans were going to be, and the sparring partners, and the long hours of getting up and doing the road work, and all of this stuff preceded it, so that by the time the fight came, the night of the fight, it was just a case of executing what you'd seen being put into practice. So that's a lot of what we're trying to shine the light on in the podcast now, but it's all that element of it, the consistency of just getting up and doing the right thing every day, being on time, being disciplined, like I sometimes use this example that like you weren't allowed to swear in the boxing gym, and it wasn't a moral judgment of swearing's bad. It was just seen as swearing was a lack of discipline, that you couldn't keep a civil voice in your head if you had to fill the silence with an F word or something like that. That was seen as a lack of discipline. A lack of discipline meant you're likely to drop your hands in the ring, which means that you're going to get beat. So it was all linked to ultimately being able to perform. So I was around that from a really young age. But the other thing about my dad was that he taught himself to read and write when he became an adult, and he ended up writing a number of books. So to help him, we used to go and do like the research with him, go to Manchester Library, and would sit for hours at a time during our holidays and weekends and evenings, helping him pull through research. And he'd write books on like boxers like Howard Winston, or he had a hero called Jackie Brown, Manchester's first ever world champion, Willie Pep, the sort of great American champion. He was writing books on people like them, and then his other passion was Manchester United. So he wrote on Jimmy Murphy, Matt Busby's assistant, and Tommy Taylor, one of the guys that died in the Munich air crash. So he was doing these books and researching them, and he'd sort of peck them out one hand, and he'd be asking us, I was like, how do you spell this word? How do you spell that? So I grew up really around him, seeing him sort of going in this world of elite sport, nurturing and developing and taking guys from being sort of anonymous into like the heights of their industry. And then I saw him applying that same principle to himself and his own life. So he was an incredible man. He passed away now 3 years ago. So at the end of his life, he had dementia, which was incredibly tough to see the impact on him. But yeah, undoubtedly, I only do what I do because he did what he did. And as you said about, hopefully your own children in the future, like, I don't remember what he gave us, because we weren't surrounded by sort of great material possessions. He was quite a humble man that sort of never lost root, like wealth or gaining material possessions had no real interest to him, because he'd come from such humble origins. He sort of lived without that stuff anyway. But it's what he taught me, the lessons he gave me that were so good. I'll tell you a quick story that I sometimes think of this, not that I would apply how he did it, but I sometimes think about it when I feel a little bit nervous or intimidated. He would because I used to go along with him. He used to take me to carry the spit bucket, so I'd be in the corner with him through all the big fights, and he was sort of like immersing me around how do you stay calm in the big moments, how do you sort of make sure that you focus on your game plan. So he was teaching us all this stuff through exposing it, and he used to let me carry the spit bucket. We had a guy fighting for a world title in Madison Square Garden, and we went out there, and there was all kinds of shenanigans going on because we were the away fighter. And one of the things he did was find a Puerto Rican guy, and this Puerto Rican guy sent when you're wrapping the bandages, the opponent will send somebody in to observe it, and you do the same in their dressing room. And that's the time, if you want to start messing around with people's heads, that's where you'll send somebody in to do it. So there's his bandaging the hands. It's this sort of really intimate process. It takes a while to do. And the minute he'd finished bandaging the hands of his fighter, this Puerto Rican camp started kicking off saying, happy with the way it's done. So they make them do it again. So at the end of the second time of doing it again, they make the same noise and fuss. And the New York Boxing Commissioner says, do it again. So at the end of the third time of doing it, so time's pressing on now. It means you can't warm up properly and all that. He starts moaning again, this Puerto Rican guy, saying, this is a disgrace and the fight's off and they're not happy with the way it's done. And what really interested me was I saw my dad doing it about a minute before he actually executed it. He sort of pushed his chair out a little bit and he said to the commissioner, he said, can I just check, who am I listening to here? He said, am I listening to you or am I listening to this Puerto Rican guy? And the New York commissioner said, no, you're listening to me. And then this Puerto Rican guy started screaming and shouting and said, no, you're not, you're listening to me. And I saw what my dad was going to do. He just got up and headbutted him. Right. And he's about 30 years, but I was in his 70s at this stage. He headbutted this guy and he sort of sent him flailing and he sort of went off and then it all got separated very quickly and he got dragged out. And when it had all calmed down afterwards, my dad turned to the guy, our fighter, and he said to them, whatever happens tonight, we're not going to be bullied. And it was such a powerful coaching lesson, right? Because I'm not advocating violence, but the point he was making was, and when I asked him afterwards, I said, why did you do that? Because he wasn't a violent man. He said on the third occasion, when he was bandaging his hands, it felt the boxer he was working with, his hand had started to shake. So he knew that the mind tricks this guy was doing had actually started to work. He'd started to panic and he'd started to shake and the adrenaline had started to get hold of him. So he needed to wrestle control back to say, we have some influence here. So it was the fact that he did it, but then it was the message afterwards of nobody's going to bully us tonight. Even though we're outside our normal comfort zone, even though we're in like the mecca of boxing, we're not going to allow ourselves to be bullied. We're going to show ourselves for who we are. And I sometimes think of that moment because I felt really proud of him in that moment because because he was outside his comfort zone, but he was really true and acting with integrity of the person he was. And I sometimes think that, like we've done shows through the podcast. We did one last year at the Royal Palladium in London, right?
Yeah.
I'm stood behind the wings. I'm thinking, what the fuck am I doing here? Like the butterflies are going and you're trying to remember what's coming next. And there's lots of people in the audience. And I remember my dad's wisdom of whatever happens tonight, nobody's going to bully you. Just show yourself. Just turn up and do your best. But just be who you are. Don't try to be somebody you're not. So it goes back, again, it's a long-winded answer, Johnny, so apologies for it.
No, it's great.
But I think, yeah, he definitely taught us through his example. And I use the same stuff like you'll see this, hopefully, as you say. I know you're getting married this summer, which is a fantastic sort of experience anyway, but congratulations to you.
Thank
But
you.
sometimes it does take seeing the world through the eyes of a child to make you realise it. That I realised for a long time that I was really I'd often have this inner voice that was often quite harsh and coruscating and quite vile the way I'd speak to myself. If you made a mistake, it'd be, you fucking idiot.
Yeah.
You do that. And I remember once, and it took my son coming along before somebody asked me, they said, how would you feel if somebody spoke to your son in the way that you speak to yourself? Now, I could have been asked that question years before that, but having a son suddenly focused my mind, and that question left me bereft. I was heartbroken. I thought, fucking, the idea that anyone might ever speak to him in such an unkind or insensitive or cruel way, and I was doing it to myself, sort of left me really upset. And that, again, was a real catalyst to go, I need to role model something better than this, because I can't ask him to do something different if I'm role modelling that kind of cruelty to myself. So I think it's a really astute point you made, John, about sometimes it's not what you give people, it's the example you give them that really counts.
Exactly, and it's fascinating, and I'm sure your father would be incredibly proud of the man you've become and what you've been able to achieve, because it's amazing. And it's so interesting that you almost followed in his footsteps in the form of coaching and writing books. And it almost interested me there because you talked about your father, that he didn't have a male role model. So then he became a role model to many. He couldn't read or write whenever he was younger. And then he learned to read and write and ended up writing books. And I think that that lesson there is probably around the fact that when there's a void in your life when you're younger, it sometimes becomes a high value of yours as you get older. And it's so interesting and intriguing that that happened for your father. And you have went on to write books and, you know, achieved things like, people probably, you know, whenever you're achieving something in your life and then you want to reach the pinnacle. I think the pinnacle of being a coach or a high performer is being able to write a book or put down your thoughts on paper. You know, how did that first book come about? And, you know, how did you go about writing it? Because were you a good writer growing up? Did you go to university writing assignments? What was that like?
Yeah, so the first book I ever did was, so I'd done the research with my dad, as I said to you. So I used to love sort of, like when I first met my wife, she called me a secret geek, right? And the reason she did was because I was sort of working as a boxing coach. I was in sort of, and in like quite an alpha male industry, if you like, where sort of somebody that would love to go home and like read a book and then talk about it to people wasn't sort of the norm. And that's not to cast any shade on anyone, but I was just a secret geek. So I would devour books, but not tell anyone about it. I'd just love it for my own pleasure. So I met my wife and she went, "You're a secret geek, aren't you?" And I was like, "Yeah, I am. I don't tell anyone." So I'd sort of been around that, but like that was my nature. Like if you offered me the chance of a good TV program or a good book, I'll take a good book every day. Yeah. So I've always loved reading and things like that. And then when the first book I ever wrote was a book called Liquid Thinking, and I'll tell you the story behind it. So long story short, when I met my wife came from a really nice family but it like her dad had been like a national sales manager and things like that. I'd never heard of anything like that. So I'd only ever been around sort of cash in hand work and things like that. And so I realised that I thought I need to get a proper job, like quite seriously when I got serious in the relationship. I thought I need to get a proper job here. So long story short, I started applying for different jobs and I said, listen, I've been to uni. My area of interest is sort of like organisation, behaviour and change. I've studied that. I've worked as a coach for a long time in sort of in these high performing cultures. So I started applying to companies saying, I don't know what I don't know, but I'm willing to come in and learn. So long story short, a company called Unilever went, "Oh, you've got an interesting background," and took a chance on me. And so they would take me into places, and my brief was often to sort of do cultural change work. And I'd done this one project at some factories just outside of Liverpool, right, for 3 years. And we'd done a big turnaround thing in terms of changing the performance and all things like that. And as I was going to leave, I thought I wanted to give the guys in the factory a book that almost was like the blueprint of what we've done to turn the site around. Now, I was faced with a bit of a quandary. These guys didn't traditionally read, so it was a bit like the sort of boxing environment. They didn't read, so I thought if I give them a textbook or something too academic or heavy, they won't read it, so I'll be wasting my money. And they were also quite cynical, so if I gave them something that was too like wishy-washy, they'd be too cynical and they'd dismiss it and they won't read it, so I'd be wasting my money. So in my naivety, I went, you know what, I'll probably just write my own book. I know the audience I'm writing for. There were 600 guys in the factory. Thought I'll write the book for them. So I had no clue what I was doing in terms of writing this. So I just set off naively and wrote a book, right? So, and then, because I didn't know what I was doing, I made a list of people that I thought I'd love to interview them, see what they think. Because I was reading references, and then I thought, well, I'll just ask them. So I'd wrote to Richard Branson and asked if I could interview him, and he was like, yeah, sure, come and interview me. So I did him, did Alex Ferguson, went out, interviewed Angelo Dundee that had been Muhammad Ali's coach. So I was doing this just for my own interest at the time, right? Taking holidays and writing in weekends and in my evenings. So I wrote the first draft of the book, and then I thought I'll show it to some of the guys that works in the factory with. And their first reaction was, this is shit. And I was like, why? And I was like, why do you think that? And they went, Richard Branson's mum and dad was rich. What's that got to do with us? He was born in privilege, right? Then they go, Muhammad Ali and Angelo Dundee. Yeah, but he was born talented, right? So their cynicism got in the way of them being willing to learn a lesson from it. So then I came up with the idea. I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll now interview guys from the factory, right? So there was a story of a guy called Steve, great bloke, who told the story. His story was incredible, right? He'd grown up and had no formal education. When he became a dad, he'd sort of set his ambition that he wanted to give his daughters the education he'd never had. So long before his daughters were old enough to understand this, he bought a plot of land in the catchment area for the best school where they lived, and then spent 3 years building a house with his own bare hands that meant he could move his family in, get his daughters to school and give them the education they'd never had, right? Wow. Incredible story. This guy worked on one of the factory lines. So I interviewed him and told this story. And then I showed how the work Steve had done was exactly the same mindset that Richard Branson had done to build his own Virgin business empire. They just came from very different places with very different means. Then I interviewed a guy who had built his own canal boat and showed how that was somebody that was able to think long-term strategically, like Alex Ferguson. Then I interviewed a guy that had been that had run his first marathon, having never run more than 10 yards, and showed how that was the same mindset that Muhammad Ali and Angelo Dundee had done. So I then put their stories in between the chapters. So I've now written this book that then I shared it with the guys in the factory, and they went, oh, it became very difficult to dismiss the lessons then, because I went to school with Steve, I went to school with Mark, I've been working with Andy for the last 20 years. So I then decided, so then all I did with the book, I got it self-published and gave everyone a copy just before I left. Here's a copy. Here's how it describes. This is the mindset that we've done. So, excuse me. I gave all the guys in the factory a copy and I left. Now, it attracted a bit of interest in sort of like the trade press at the time, because like being a guy who'd written a book about their own staff featuring lads Richard Branson, I can see why there was a level of intrigue to it. But then what happened was I started getting inquiries from outside of the company saying, oh, can we get a copy of this book? And I was like, I've only self-published it. I've paid for it myself. So then what I started doing was I just got some extra copies, and any money I made, I gave it to my dad when we were running the boxing club. So it just funded that. So I just saw it all as being sort of, like, it was a virtuous circle. There was no losers for it. And then I wrote my second book but I'd already left the business at this stage. But anyway, that's how the first book is. A book, it's on sale. It's called Liquid Thinking. But the idea behind it was never to sort of take it to the general public. It was always done with a very specific market of 600 cynical scousers that were going to read it. But then it sort of made me realise just how much I liked the process of writing. So my secret geekdom came out of, I like delving into rabbit holes, doing the research. But then I really like the idea of how can you communicate these ideas in really interesting ways or accessible ways that people could go, oh, I can get that. I can read it. So me and my dad did a couple of books on Thomas Hearns, Marvin Hagler and Sugar Ray Robinson together, which was a really lovely way. So the last book we did, the Marvin Hagler book, my dad had been diagnosed with dementia, and there was a degree of panic in me. I was like, Dad, I need to keep you active. I need to keep your brain ticking over as much as we can. So we'd already done one on Robinson and we did one on Hearns. And then my dad said, okay, we'll do the Hagler one together. So it was sort of like a bit of a race against time, but it was done more because I wanted to sort of keep that flame burning in my dad before dementia started to extinguish it. So I've done that, and then I've just carried on writing books for the pleasure. Since, well, nobody's ever taught me how to do it. It's all been a bit of trial and error, and making mistakes and sort of tripping up along the way. But yeah, that's the origin story of the first book, Liquid Thinking.
Yeah, fantastic. And just a quick one, why Liquid Thinker?
Well, so this is a multiple choice question here, Johnny. So you'll have to decide whether it's one or the other, or the answer might be both. So the first one was that Edward de Bono He's the creativity guru, the guy behind the 6 thinking hats and things like that. One of the points that he says is that most of our errors in life happen down to what he describes as solid thinking, the inability to see things from a different angle or take somebody else's perspective. So I thought the opposite of solid thinking was liquid thinking, the ability to be fluid and to deal with things in the moment. The second answer, so that's choice A. Choice B is that I was sat in the pub with my mate, right, and I was telling him about the book I was doing, and I was saying, I've not got a title for it, and I need to come up with something catchy. And he was inspired by the pint that was in front of him. And he went, why don't you just call it liquid thinking? So I went to the bar and I said, if I buy you the next round, I think it was his term, but I said, if I buy you the next round, can I buy does that acquire the rights off you? And he went, yeah, fine. So you choose, it's A or B or C, which is both.
Unreal. Absolutely love it. I think C, definitely. There's probably both involved. But
that's true. Yeah, exactly. The Edward de Bono one came later and I thought I better come up with
there has to be some sense
a little bit
behind
clever.
it. Yeah, absolutely. No, definitely. And that's fantastic. And it's amazing that you were able to interview all these people before you maybe had the platform or the opportunity to connect with these people. And there must have been times where people told you no because, you know, you reach out to these caliber of people, you maybe don't get a reply, etc. So there's 2 questions here. The first one is, you know, how do you cope and how do you react when you were getting no's like that back then? And also, you've mastered the art of asking questions, holding space, interviewing people, and we know that questions are the steering wheel of the mind, but how have you done that?
Okay, well, if we take them in turn, because they're 2 brilliant questions. The first one, yeah, so what I did, and again, this was the naivety, was I always went, well, if it's true that we're only ever 6 degrees of separation from anybody, and I think, right, I'd like to interview Muhammad Ali, right, when he was still alive, how do I do that? And then just by thinking via 6 degrees of separation, I realised I was 1 person removed from him in terms of, well, or 2. So my dad was friends with his coach, Angelo Dundee. Angelo and my dad had gone back a long way. So I said to my dad, do you know Angelo's number? He went, yeah, passed it on, phoned Angelo Dundee, ended up sort of going out to Miami and spending time with him. He passed on the manuscript to Muhammad Ali, who said, this is great, according to Angelo, sent it back and said, no, more than happy that you can sort of give it. So Angelo wrote a testimonial for the book on him and Muhammad Ali's behalf. Richard Branson, again, we just work backwards. So 6 degrees of separation is always quite helpful. So if you know somebody that might know them, that at least gives you the opportunity where you can put your case forward. And some of them just went, no, it's not for me, or I can't spare the time or help. And that's fine. My view was always, I was always really graceful about it, or tried to be. Like, I don't know if you see it in your world, and I sometimes think this now, like people will often ask me for a favour, and my big problem is saying no. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's always like, if I can help, I always will. But I'm always intrigued by the amount of people that come back and just say thank you afterwards, or give you an acknowledgement, because that often then tells you more about them, of they've got what they want and then they move off. And I always try to keep that in mind. So even if they said no, I'd still write them a thank you afterwards, just to say thanks for at least considering it. Those that did, I'd often write them, you know, a bit of a eulogising note afterwards to say thank you. But I often found that whatever the response was, it was still incumbent to reply and to handle it with grace.
Yeah. What about if you didn't get a response? How did you feel?
Well, I still do it now, actually. I'm a bit of a nuisance, so I'll go back and ask at least a couple of times before I sense that I'm sort of trying somebody's patience. But I don't just do the same thing of, like, will you do it? No. Will you do it? No. I would then try and find, well, why not? Or try and think of a different angle. And then eventually you go, well, it's not on me. It's just not the right time. So I think it's important not to take it personally. You know, I think that's what I learned from that as long as you polite and respectful and somebody gives you, like silence is also an answer. You know what I mean? I think we forget that. Silence is it's not a non-answer. It is an answer. So you have to sort of read into that. And once you've tried a couple of times, if it's not for them, so it's not for you to keep being a nuisance, I think. but yeah, yeah. So that's how I did it. And then when we did it on the podcast, I think what coming back to what I said to you in the early answer, I think just having relationships where people trusted us. Like, I'll give you an example for that. That the night before we interviewed Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, I texted him and I said to him, tomorrow when we meet, we're going to talk about your experience as manager at Cardiff that had ended in sort of ignominy. And I just want you to know that. And because I didn't want to be snide or try and trip him up or try and be too clever with him. And he came back and he went, I would expect you to ask that. So thanks for checking in, but that's absolutely fine. So I think having that thing where about trust is really important again. But to answer your second question, that was really kind and generous that you said around asking questions. I feel like I'm stumbling forward. Like I've learned massively about asking questions, because doing it on a podcast where you're very good at it. So I can recognize good when the presence of it, because I feel like that for me, it's a process of I'm trying to learn how to be good. I think often it's about trying to be succinct. I think there's a danger, and I've fallen into this a few times. So these are not things that I claim I know how to do it. It's stuff that when I've reflected afterwards, I've gone, nah, don't try and be too clever with people. You know what I mean? Like, don't be trying to show them how much knowledge you have. You're there to make them shine. So ask your question and get out of the way. I think sometimes don't try and interrupt, just let people talk. They'll indicate when they're finished. And I think lean into the discomfort as well. Sometimes there's all that second question. It's like a deeper question. So we did an interview with a guy called Charles Duhigg. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, and he's written a brilliant book called Super Communicators that sort of captured a lot of what I'm saying. He explained it better than I did. But Super Communicators talks about deep questions. So deep questions are like, you might say, somebody might tell you, like, if you give an example from what I've said earlier about, let's say about my dad, and you might go, so can you think of a specific incident that really stands out in your relationship with your dad? And then it maybe go a bit deeper again. So what is it that incident has done for you? So, and then it might be deeper again. So how do you pass that knowledge on to other people? So it's just about sometimes being willing to go deeper with a topic and really explore it and excavate it. Because what I find is that for the person that's giving the answer, it's often intriguing for them to try and unravel their thoughts, as well as for the person that's listening to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And on deeper questions, let's rock and roll with one.
Go on.
Yeah. So everyone will look at you, Damian Hughes, the guy that's got it all figured out, the business, the family, the success, right? But there must have been something that nearly broke you. There must have been a challenge. There must have been some form of hardship that you've overcame to be where you are today. If you feel comfortable sharing, I'd love to know what that would have been.
Yeah, well, I challenge the first idea that I've got anything figured out. I certainly haven't. But so that by definition means that there's been lots of challenges that have come along the way as you're trying to work it out. I think how you frame those challenges, it's easy to say it when you're not in it, but when you're in it, to talk about, well, what's it teaching you, what you're learning from it. But I think the first thing I'd say for that is that one of the big things that's come through this is being kind to yourself. So I'll give you an example that I referenced it earlier about when my son was born. I kept going to the doctors about 18 months in, and he stopped me one day and he went, have you had a look at yourself in the mirror, mate? And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, burnt out, look at you. Because I was going with this persistent cough, and he was like, you start the cough, it's your lifestyle, look what you're doing. And that was a real catalyst for me to sort of look in the mirror and realise that I was being too cruel to myself. I was driving myself to this point of being as close as what I understand it to burnout or a breakdown as I could have gone. So that was certainly a long moment, and it took me a long time to sort of climb back out of that hole. So I was functioning, but sort of it was coming at a cost. And I think what I eventually did realise with that, Johnny, is that there was three things that I'd almost neglected to do for myself. The first one I just referenced a few moments ago was about being kind. And I know that's sort of like a phrase that you stick on a tea towel these days or something like that. But what I mean by that was I wasn't being particularly kind to myself, because like pushing yourself beyond the point of any rational sort of level of exhaustion, and then making a mistake, and I'd be like, "You fucking idiot, how can you do this?" Like that inner voice just wasn't a particularly kind one. And I thought I need to try and change that. And it was that question somebody said, "How would you feel if someone spoke to your son like that?" Was a need to go, I need to change this narrative massively. The second, and what I've realised though is through sort of trying to do that to myself and be kind to myself, just your capacity to be kind to others goes up as well. Because then you see other people making mistakes or going through a tough time, and you don't look at them and go, "Well, you fucking idiot." You go, "You all right, mate? How can I lend you a hand? Like even me sharing this example here, that it doesn't feel comfortable to share it, but I think, well, if I'm being kind to myself, I can be kind to your listeners and go, it might help if anyone's going through a similar stage themselves. The second thing I realised was that I was rubbish at saying no, and that was sort of like linked to the kindness thing. But I'll give you an example where I've never been in trouble. Right? I've never been in trouble with the police, right? And then I found myself in trouble with the police once because my capacity to not say no got me in it. So I was doing some work, and a charity had phoned me up in Manchester and said, "Can you help us out?" And I just couldn't do it, right? At best, I needed 4 hours to do the job, and I only had a 3-hour window. So the answer should have just been, "No, sorry." But I found it really difficult to do that. So I said, "Yeah, I could," thinking I'll figure it out. And I ended up sort of like trying to squeeze 4 hours into 3, and I was driving too fast and got caught by the police. And I was really ashamed. I was like, because I'd never sat in the back of a police car, I'd never been in trouble like that. And the police pulled me to one side. And it was a line that one of the officers used. I tried to offer them the mitigation. I went, "Listen, I've just been helping a charity. I've been doing this, and I'm now trying to get back to work." And he went, "Nobody gives a shit, mate." He said, "You were driving the car. Take responsibility." And I was like, "Yeah, actually, you're absolutely right." As harsh a lesson it was, he was like, "Nobody cares whether you think you're being a good person or you can sort of cloak yourself in sort of charity endeavours. Are you being a decent person?" And the answer was, I wasn't. And I'd done it because I felt too weak just to say no. So there's a difference between being nice and being kind, is what I've realised on the back of that. That I was being nice by saying yes. Being kind would have been being kind to myself to go, "No, I can't do it." And I'd say myself getting into trouble. Like,
Yeah.
I ended up getting points on my license. That was the conclusion of it. But it was still sort of a harsh lesson. And
Yeah.
then the last lesson I realised was that if you are going to do something, give it your all. So going back to my dad used to say to me when I was a kid, he used to say, "If nobody would notice your absence, that means your presence hasn't made much of a difference." And that really stuck with me. It's like, right, if you're going to do something, show up and do your best at it. Do you know what I mean? And you might, if you can't do it, say no, and do that as well. And if you've decided you can do it while being kind to yourself, great. But when you're there, give it your absolute best. So they're the three things that sort of came out of that really difficult period where I was sort of compromising lots of situations and just putting myself in some sticky spots.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've seen this in the interviews that you've done, but sometimes the best lessons that you can gain from someone who inspires you or someone who's a role model is whenever they're open, honest, and vulnerable about a challenge that they potentially went through, and that's exactly what you've done. So I appreciate the honesty. And just to close off, this episode, it's been absolutely incredible. It's been great to hear your lessons and, dissect exactly what you have to say, and it's been inspiring to say the least. But for you, and we always close every episode with this, but what does the podcast is called The Unstoppable Podcast. What does becoming unstoppable mean to you?
That's a brilliant question. I think the nature of the question invites a singular answer of, like, don't give up or something like that. I think there's something more to it than that, and if you'll permit me, I'll just explain the origins of where my answer will come from. I was lucky enough to interview a medical doctor called Dr. Peter Attia, who is based out in Austin in Texas, and he wrote a book called Outlive, which is basically it's a summary of his career, which is just being curious. So he basically asks the question, how long should most people be able to live for? And what he estimates is we're all built for something, on average, he says, something built for procreation or success. So when I said, what does that mean? He went, your body adapts, and most people have got the capacity to live into that, to 90 plus. And yet he said, but life expectancy is 78. So his question is, so what happens to those 12 years that many people leave on the tables? And he talks about 12 years of good health as well. So what he did was he went to areas around the world called blue zones, where life expectancy tends to exceed 90 plus. And he started looking at, well, what do these people do that the rest of us could learn from? And given the geographical diversity of it, you couldn't just go and say, oh, it's because of the weather or it's the diet they eat. They played a part, but he said he was so diverse that it was impossible just to give a silver bullet response. And eventually he went to a Japanese community where life expectancy, I think, was about 93. And they actually explained it to him. He said, oh, well, we have a word for what you're looking for. And the word's come into the English language over the last few years. It's called ikigai. But from Japanese, it translates as what gets you up in the morning. And what they found is that there's no one answer to that question. So this links back to how do you define unstoppable? But ikigai basically says you need to ask yourself 4 really simple questions on a regular basis. But keep coming back to answer these questions. So the first question is, how much time do I spend really enjoying what I do? So if you think of all the activities you do, like, how much time do you actually spend enjoying it? The second question is, how much time do you actually play to your strengths rather than mitigate against your weaknesses? So not only do you enjoy doing it, but actually find yourself doing what you're good at. The third question is, how much time do you spend making a positive difference to the lives of those that are important to you? So it might be your family, it might be the community, it might be social groups you join, but how much time do you spend making a positive difference to others? And then the fourth question is, and how can you get paid for doing all of this stuff? But what he said is, if you can answer those 4 questions on a regular basis, it's somewhere in the middle you'll find that sweet spot, which is what they call ikigai, that'll get you up in the morning. But to answer your question is, what that sweet spot is where you become unstoppable. When you do what you love, do what you're good at, do what makes a difference to yourself and others. And if you're lucky enough to find a way of generating some kind of income from it, that to me is unstoppable.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the last hour, I felt that all the questions that you just provided, I've answered yes to. So it's great. Thanks very much. Thoroughly enjoyed it, Damian. It's been an absolute pleasure. And yeah, where can people find you if they want to check out your stuff?
Well, the High Performance Podcast is available on the usual platforms where you get podcasts from. There's an app where people can get early access releases, and again, that's free for people to do that. My work is on liquidthinker.com. So if there's any questions people might have on the back of this, there's a contact page there that I'll get the email and I'll get back to people if it helps. But can I just say, Johnny, I think I just wanted to say again, thank you for being kind and generous enough to invite me on and listen for the last hours we've chatted. I think what you're doing with the coaching work is incredible. The difference you are making to so many people's lives is significant. So it's a real privilege to come along and chat with you. So thanks for your time.
Thanks, Damian. It means the world.